Let me make this a bit bigger. Right, yeah, hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Karina, and one of the founders of the campaign to stop the rebuilding of the Edmonton Incinerator. So good to know you're familiar with what I'm talking about, but just to set the scene so that we're all up to speed. So the Edmonton Incinerator, it's that big chimney just off the A406. It burns 90% of the black bins of the 7 North London boroughs. And this I'm talking about Hackney, Barnet, Haringey, Islington, Enfield, Waltham Forest, and Camden, and Islington, in fact. Yeah. It's been operational since 1969, so over 50 years. It is owned by London Energy, itself wholly owned by the North London Waste Authority, which is a body that is composed of the 7 boroughs I've just mentioned. The board of the authority is composed of 14 councillors, 2 from each of the 7 North London boroughs, and is therefore Labour controlled, as most of the boroughs are Labour controlled, all of them apart from Barnet, and is chaired by Councillor Clyde Lokes of Waltham Forest, and has been for the last decade. So it's been there for the last 50 years, and there are now plans to essentially rebuild and expand and rebrand the Edmonton Incinerator to become the North London Eco Park imminently, essentially. So the current incinerator is 50 years old, coming to the end of its life. About 10 years ago, the North London Waste Authority started to think about what to do next, and first decided to replace the incinerator. The assessments and consultations were held in 2014-15, and the development consent order was granted by the government in February 2017. So I think what's really important to note is that usually incinerators are granted planning permission by the local councils, but this one's so large, it's deemed a piece of national infrastructure. So like a major airport or a major road, it needs the planning permission of central government of Bays, which it was granted by the Secretary of State in 2017. On site is also a recycling centre, a visitor centre. Also important to note, there's plan to generate heat and energy from this project, including heat that will help heat Enfield's Meridian Water housing complex. And really important to note, essentially the process is in motion for this to happen now. The site clearance work has already begun, and the building works for the incinerator are currently out to contract. So this is really a late intervention, a late desperate intervention in this process. The plan is for the new incinerator to be up and running by 2025. It will be built next to the current incinerator. And once it's up and running, the current incinerator will be decommissioned, and 2027 is the latest date. It could well be operational until 2075, based on the 50-year lifespan of the current incinerator. So what do we want as a group, as a campaign group? Well, essentially, we are calling on the NLWA, the North London Waste Authority, to immediately pause and review its plan to rebuild and expand the Edmonton Incinerator. I am going to condense this presentation that I've given quite a few times now into a few myths, things the North London Waste Authority might have said, and why I think, we have a strong case calling for this pause and review. So I think I've got 6 myths in total. So myth 1, here we are. Well, when I first raised these concerns with the North London Waste Authority, the answer has been there's been extensive consultation. The truth is, actually, no one knows about this plan. I've now spoken to hundreds of members of the community, directly affected people, MPs, aspiring MPs, Labour Party members, environmental activists. People do not know about this plan. Key examples include Faiza Shaheen, who of course fought the Chingford seat and grew up right next to the incinerator. She didn't know about it. John Cryer, who is Clyde Lokes' own MP, did not know about it. Extinction Rebellion, very active, no idea. And people just do not know about it. And I've, all the school mums in my local area, we live about a mile away from the incinerator, hadn't heard about it either. I've been engaging with Ian Duncan Smith, unfortunately my MP, for a while on this. In his view, he thinks probably the consultation would have been a lot more expensive, had there not been an existing incinerator on site. The 2014-15 consultation was really limited to this area here, which is a mile radius around the incinerator. There was no further consultation across North London. Regardless of this, an argument I've put forward to the North London Waste Authority is that actually, even if consent was secured by communities back then, public opinion and concerns about air pollution and climate change and plastics has really evolved so significantly since 2015 that we really need to query, whether the NLWA has the consent of people today, and knowing what we know now about, air pollution, plastics, and so forth. Mythbuster 2, and I'm really speeding here, we're working hard to increase air quality in North London. The North London Waste Authority have the cheek to put out these kind of statements. I mean, the reality is, of course, is that building a new incinerator in one of the poorest wards in London, majority BME, will actually be detrimental to air quality over the next 50 years. I mean, there's no way in which you improve air quality building an incinerator. It's really worth noting the 2014 health impact assessment was really on the construction phase only. There have been no studies carried out on cumulative impacts of exposure to the plumes of the incinerator. So I got someone who loves doing this kind of stuff to model the plumes. What would they look like? Where would they fall? And this is what he came up with. So if you Google plume plot at Edmonton places, you can see this. Oh, screaming kids in the background, I apologize. You can see this, and we've also plotted the primary schools that are affected by the plumes. And I'll also say that since the DCO was granted, there's been this huge increase in our understanding of the kind of the detrimental health impacts of poor air pollution. If you think about transport, we know we need to change transport, and really, even more worrying, we now know that the risks of severe COVID-19 increase significantly when people have had chronic exposure to air pollution. So just for the record, we know why are incinerators polluting? Well, essentially, what an incinerator does, it turns material into really titchy particles, particulate matter, microscopic particles that are then scattered to the five winds. An estimate from a group, the Particulate Matter Parliamentary Research Group, in last December estimated the current incinerator probably releases 1.8 billion PM2.5 per second. Vast quantities, vast quantities. And it's worth noting that there is no equipment to filter these really, really small particles. What do we know about them? Well, we know that DEFRA says there is no safe level for particulate matter. And we also know that Waltham Forest has the second highest PM2.5 concentration of all boroughs in the country. Note that Waltham Forest is downwind from the incinerator, indeed downwind from most of London's pollution. Is there a cause? I'm not sure. However, it's clear we need to really redouble our efforts to improve air quality rather than build a new incinerator. Also worth noting that the argument is often, oh, well, it will operate within legal limits. While that's true, by the current operator's own reporting, emissions limits of diverse pollutants are routinely breached, and the Environment Agency does not have the capacity to enforce, routine minor breaches. Oh, I'm not sure. Sorry. Hope this is better for you guys, right? Yeah. So it's interesting. Basically, I always was starting to argue that we're failing to apply the precautionary principle here. Obviously, Public Health England conclude there are no major health risks. However, two very recent studies, one suggested, peer-reviewed obviously, one suggested that living closer to the incinerator is associated with a very small increase in the risk of some birth defects. That's not reassuring. And a study in the last few, again peer-reviewed in the last few weeks, saw that living close to an incinerator, there's an accumulation of some metals in the toenails of children. This is very worrying, of course, because Enfield Council want to build Meridian Water right next to it. And also I'll add that it's not so much failing to apply the precautionary principle, it's actually citing an incinerator in a poor place. You know, the rich are already applying the precautionary principle. Maybe to add, people have been quite flippant about this. Clyde Lokes, haven't been waiting 50 years for a Public Health England report. Well, you know, Sadiq Khan, interestingly, has come out strongly against the proposed incinerator in South London. He's launched a judicial review. He says it's a toxic air. He says emissions are bad for our health, but he's washing his hands of Edmonton. So I don't know why, you know, concerned about the health of people in South London, but unfortunately that does not extend to the people of North London. Essentially, I would argue that the incinerator is the product of a classist, racist planning process. You know, if you look at, this is a recent, well, very recent, last few weeks, the COVID-19 cases and mortalities in Enfield, you'll see that the worst affected place is in Edmonton. Cockfosters on the left here has a lot of care homes. That's an anomaly, but here on the southeast, it's the poorer part of the borough, 60% BAME communities and where the incinerator is. And interestingly, just last week, Cambridgeshire County Council refused planning permission for an incinerator on the grounds that it would mess the view from Ely Cathedral. You know, it would be a blot on the landscape. So obviously, this is really extraordinary double standards. Talk about a blot on the landscape versus pollution over pollution over primary schools in some of the poorer parts of the country. Myth 3, we need an incinerator to deal with North London's residual waste. That sounds convincing. However, the truth, the planned incinerator is 3 times too large for North London's residual waste needs. So I'll get to why that's the case in a moment, but since that's the case, you know, we've pointed out that this will create an incentive to produce more waste, and the North London Waste Authority has countered that argument, saying that actually the plan is now to burn commercial waste in addition to household waste, and to import waste from other boroughs outside North London. This is a new plan, and the reason this is really significant is that this is not a plan that figured in the original DCO documents. It's a plan that hasn't been costed, hasn't been assessed from an environmental perspective, and crucially hasn't been consulted on either. The people of Enfield, the people were consulted on, dealing with North London's residual waste. This is no longer the purpose of this incinerator. It's also worth noting that 80% of what is burned in the current incinerator is actually recyclable or compostable. And in that sense, it's not actually residual waste. This is a figure provided by Clyde Lokes to Stella Creasy. So it's the man himself. This is a recognition that about 80% of it. And of course, Clyde Lokes also says, we ought to be increasing our recycling rates, recognizing this is the case. So we are not actually burning residual waste in the incinerator at the moment. We're actually burning recyclable, compostable waste, also known as resources, right? So it's quite a different thing. Interesting to note as well is that the capacity of the proposed incinerator is predicated on failing to meet targets. Current household recycling rates are about 30%. We were meant to have reached a 50% recycling by 2020. That hasn't happened. The capacity was estimated on a 50% recycling rate, despite the fact that some councils are already recycling on 65%, despite the fact that Sadiq Khan has set a 70% recycling rate target for London by 2035. So we are building an incinerator here on a capacity requirement that is, that is kind of doomed to fail, right? We're building for failure. Now, this is really interesting. Waste estimates, kind of waste arising that were commissioned when they were planning the capacity for the new incinerator have already been proven completely wrong. The consultants got it completely wrong. And to be fair to them, in their report that I've seen, they said actually it's really hard to predict. And you can see this is their forecast waste arising, and in blue, in red is actually what the North London Waste Authority has reported. So you can see that at the moment we're close already to close to 150,000 tonne discrepancy between what we thought we were going to get and what's actually happened. So essentially, the incinerator will really lock us into this kind of high waste prevention and low recycling rates. And we know that's the case already. There's a very strong correlation between low recycling, low composting, and high incineration. That makes sense. You've built this giant piece of kit, to burn materials. There's an opportunity cost. You cannot spend it on recycling and, prevention programs, and a lot gets burnt. Myth number 4. This is really perhaps one of the most egregious ones of the lot.
Yeah, that's 15 minutes so far, Karina.
Yeah, cool. I will speed up like crazy. But this is one of the most egregious ones of the lot. The incinerator is, quote, crucial to tackling the climate emergency. Not true. Actually, the truth is there's widespread consensus that the best approach to waste management from a climate perspective is waste prevention by far. We want to find ways to avoid the waste coming up in the first place, recycling, then this process called MBT, mechanical biological treatment, and then landfill for genuine residual waste. These are various quotes, DEFRA have said this, the Scottish Government have said this, Therese Coffey has said this. I will speed through. So why is incineration so bad for the climate? Well, essentially, burning waste produces vast amounts of greenhouse gases. About a ton of greenhouse gas per ton of waste burnt, which is, this is consistent with what DEFRA have to say. They estimate between 0.7 and 1.7. So let's think about a ton. The capacity of this incinerator is about 700,000 tons of waste, therefore emitting around 700,000 tons of CO2. Some back of the envelope calculations that we did, the new incinerator will probably produce as much greenhouse gases over 50 years as the whole of London does in 2, or the burning of the waste of a North London borough, Hackney is where we analyse this, represents about 10 to 15% of the overall emissions, but it's not being accounted for by any of the boroughs. Super important here, people always say, but actually you're generating energy. Absolutely you are, but it's really worth noting, and this is really crucial, that the energy being generated is neither renewable, needs to be fed, waste, nor low carbon. If you could, complex calculations, but essentially you can work out in terms of how much energy was generated, how much waste, that on average, the UK incinerators in 2017, the carbon intensity of the energy fed into the grid is kind of, quite close to coal and actually less carbon efficient than natural gas. So essentially, I'll say, the proposed incinerator goes directly against efforts to decarbonise the energy grid and net zero targets. It'll be one of the dirtiest forms of energy feeding into the grid. There are no plans for carbon capture and storage, despite the Climate Change Committee saying this is necessary for new incinerator plans. It will produce heat that will fail to meet the new future home standards that suggest that heating must be decarbonised by 2025. There is no climate case for the incinerator. Essentially, I don't use this word lightly, but I'll say the North London Waste Authority is lying when it claims it does. And why is that? Well, it's a few things to say. The DCO was granted under another planning regime where they didn't have to talk about climate change impacts. They frantically commissioned a study in 2019 to kind of, to talk about incineration and climate. This study is full of, the parameters were set by the North London Waste Authority. They did not follow the methodology put forward by the Committee on Climate Change. And essentially, what we have now is the North London Waste Authority is refusing to engage on a climate change perspective. Extinction Rebellion have done huge amounts of research on the climate change impacts, and the North London Waste Authority has refused to disclose any data or to refute, to be able to repudiate these claims. Myth 5, I'll speed up even more. Incinerator is the most cost-effective option. The truth, we don't know that. Until last November, it was projected that the whole project would be 650 million. In November, now it's been announced it's 1.2 billion. So, we don't know that is actually the most cost-effective option because the alternatives haven't been sufficiently analysed or costed. It's worth noting this will be paid for by your council taxes with a loan period of 40 years. There's been no analysis on the effect of council taxes. What would a future incineration tax mean? What would the inclusion in the EU emissions trading scheme mean, or the UK emissions trading scheme? And right now, one of our campaigners is taking BEIS to court to make sure incinerators get included in the UK's emission trading scheme. If you have some spare cash, we would gladly receive it. But the point is, this has not been costed. You know, the reality has not been costed, or indeed, neither has the need to retrofit carbon capture and storage, which would be a huge piece of infrastructure. Myth 6, and this is my last one, the incinerator promotes the circular economy. And this is frankly offensive. The truth is, incineration is the greatest barrier to the circular economy. You don't need to believe me. Professor Sir Ian Boyd, you know, when he was chief scientific advisor to DEFRA, you know, he really made this point that what happens in incinerators is that you're putting materials and they are lost forever. You know, you are precluding any kind of reuse. And what actually incineration does, what it drives continued material and fossil fuel extractions, it enables consumerism, and possibly worse, it kind of enables business models that create, you know, private profit and socialized loss. You know, kind of basically, you know, we're socializing the cost of all the packaging of the likes of Tesco and Nestle and others. So this is one of the most offensive things that the North London Waste Authority have said, amongst many offensive things. So just to wrap up as to why I'm here, you know, I've been campaigning on this now for close to 2 years, including personally taking BASE to court unsuccessfully. And I've come to realize that I think securing any kind of pause and review at the 11th hour requires Labour Party members to take this on. And why is that? Because actually, you know, there's not a great deal, you know, we've reached the limits of what we can do as communities, as residents. Extinction Rebellion, you know, to be fair to them, are doing a lot of great work, but it's not for everyone, you know. And you know, the people who have the power here are the council leaders, largely Labour. So, you know, what I would call on you to, you know, challenge your council leaders on this, especially in regards to equalities and air pollution and community participation, where really this is a project that is lacking. Holding Sadiq Khan to account, you know, he is, as I said, he's calling for a judicial review for the new South London incinerator, but has really washed his hands of Edmonton. I'm not quite sure how he's getting away with this, if I'm entirely honest. Putting the pressure on North London Waste Authority board members, especially the chair, Clyde Lokes. Again, you know, they are the people who could decide to put a brake on this, but I will say I have been absolutely dismayed at the North London Waste Authority. A body that is accountable to no one, as far as I can make out. The chair's been in post for 10 years, while the other board members have been rotating on and off for 2 years and do not have a good knowledge of the issue. I've assisted some of their meetings, and they struggle to hold. There's good governance is lacking, essentially. And securing motion against the incinerator award level, it's worth noting that we had started a process of getting Labour Party members, you know, presenting at Labour Party members at Labour Party ward meetings, and motions were passed by Labour Party members, including in both Hackney constituencies against. In Waltham Forest and Hyams Park, I spoke against Rosalind Doré, who's one of the councillors at the North London Waste on the North London Waste Authority board. And despite that, a motion against the incinerator for a pause and review was passed 25-3. So, you know, I find it quite extraordinary that the grassroots membership is being ignored as it is, but I'm not a Labour Party member, so you know, yeah, I don't know. So that's basically maybe it, and you know, happy to take any questions. So some resources for here on Incineration UK Win, on our campaign that has a value for money study recommendation, and all the kind of climate change materials developed by Extinction Rebellion. Here, the crowdfunder I mentioned, really important. You know, the incinerators have been excluded from emissions trading. They managed to secure an exemption. We're trying to make sure that that loophole is closed. And this is Twitter, Stop the Rebuild, mixture of informative articles and some angry bile as well, and our WhatsApp group as well of our campaigners, which anyone's welcome to join. So yeah, thank you very much.